Billionaire's son orders black maid to leave, not knowing she's his long-lost sister. What if the person you dismissed without a second thought held the key to healing your deepest wound? Marcus Wellington stood in his father's marble foyer, adjusting his designer tie as he prepared for another day of board meetings and business deals. At 35, he'd inherited everything: the mansion, the company, the cold emptiness that seemed to follow wealth like a shadow. He'd grown up believing he was alone in this world, an only child whose mother had died when he was barely 2 years old. But that morning, something about the new housekeeper caught his attention in a way that unsettled him. Maybe it was how she hummed while she worked, the same melody his father used to hum years ago, or perhaps it was the gentle way she moved through the house as if she belonged there. Her name was Grace, and she had kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets he couldn't quite grasp. As she arranged fresh flowers in the crystal vase his mother once loved, Marcus felt a strange pull in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name. Where are you watching from? Have you ever felt that unexplainable connection to a stranger? Grace Johnson had been working as a housekeeper for wealthy families for over 15 years, but she'd never felt drawn to a job quite like this one. Something about the Wellington mansion felt familiar, though she'd never set foot inside before last week. She moved through the grand rooms with careful precision, dusting antiques and polishing silver, while her employer's son watched her with an intensity that made her nervous. Marcus had a reputation around town: brilliant in business but distant with people, the kind of man who built walls instead of bridges. His father, Charles Wellington, had been kinder during their brief interview, his weathered face softening when he looked at her. "You remind me of someone," he'd said quietly, but when Grace asked who, he'd simply shaken his head and walked away. That Tuesday morning, everything changed. Marcus stormed into the kitchen where Grace was preparing lunch, his face flushed with anger from a phone call that had gone poorly. "I don't know what you're trying to pull," he snapped, his voice sharp as broken glass. "But I've noticed things missing around here since you started. My father might be too trusting, but I'm not." Grace's hands trembled as she set down the sandwich she'd been making. She'd faced accusations before. It came with the territory of working in homes where people had more money than trust, but something about Marcus's tone cut deeper than usual. "I haven't taken anything, Mr. Wellington," she said softly, her dignity intact despite the hurt in her voice. "I would never." But Marcus had already turned away, dismissing her with a wave of his hand like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. As Grace stood alone in the kitchen, tears threatening to fall, she touched the small locket at her throat, the only connection she had to a family she'd lost long ago. She had no idea that upstairs, in Charles Wellington's study, sat a photograph that would change everything. The tension in the Wellington house grew thicker each day. Marcus made it clear he wanted Grace gone, questioning her work and making her feel unwelcome at every turn. But Grace needed this job desperately. Her elderly aunt's medical bills were mounting, and housekeeping positions that paid well were hard to find. She endured his cold stares and sharp comments, holding on to her dignity like armor. Charles Wellington, meanwhile, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. He would watch Grace from doorways when he thought no one was looking, his eyes filled with something that looked like recognition mixed with pain. One afternoon, while cleaning Charles's study, Grace accidentally knocked over a stack of old photo albums. As she knelt to gather the scattered pictures, her breath caught in her throat. There, in a faded photograph, was a young woman who looked exactly like her. The same warm brown eyes, the same gentle smile, even the same small birthmark on her left cheek. The woman was holding a baby, standing next to a younger Charles Wellington. Grace's hands shook as she studied the image, her heart pounding with questions she was afraid to ask. "That's my wife, Elena," came a quiet voice from the doorway. Charles stood there, his face pale and drawn. "She died in a car accident 33 years ago. But she wasn't alone in the car that day." Grace felt the world shift beneath her feet. "She had our daughter with her. Our little girl was only 6 months old. The police said there were no survivors, but—" His voice broke. "But they never found her body. I've wondered every day since then if somehow she might have survived." The photograph slipped from Grace's fingers as she stared at the man who might be her father. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The resemblance was undeniable, But could it really be possible? As Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion at seeing his father's tears, Grace realized their lives were about to change forever. Marcus felt his world tilting as he watched his father's emotional breakdown. "What's going on here?" he demanded, but his voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by something closer to fear. Charles held up the photograph with trembling hands, and for the first time, Marcus really looked at Grace, not as an employee or a threat, but as a person. The resemblance to the woman in the picture was startling, impossible to ignore. Grace felt overwhelmed, caught between hope and terror. "I was found as a baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "At a hospital 33 years ago. They said I was brought in by a good Samaritan who found me by a crashed car. I never knew." She touched her locket again, the one thing she'd had since childhood. With shaking fingers, she opened it to reveal a tiny photograph of a young woman, the same woman from Charles's album. "The nurse said this was pinned to my blanket," she explained. Marcus sank into a chair, the weight of his behavior crushing down on him. All those harsh words, the suspicion, the dismissal, directed at someone who might be his sister. His sister, who he'd mourned without ever knowing her, who he'd dreamed about as a lonely child. "I thought I was protecting this house," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I thought I was protecting my father from being taken advantage of. Instead, I was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Tentatively, and took Grace's hand. "Elena always said if anything happened to her, she'd find a way back to us. Maybe she did." The DNA test would confirm what their hearts already knew, but right then, in that study surrounded by 3 decades of grief and misunderstanding, they already felt like family. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting golden shadows on old photographs and new possibilities, Marcus realized he had 33 years of brother love to make up for, and Grace wondered if she finally had found her way home. The DNA results came back 3 weeks later, but the Wellington family had already begun to heal. The numbers on the paper simply confirmed what their hearts had whispered from that first day. Grace Johnson was Elena Grace Wellington, the daughter who had been mourned for over 3 decades. Marcus had spent those weeks getting to know his sister, learning about her life of resilience and kindness despite growing up in foster care. She told him about the families who had loved her, the ones who hadn't, and how she'd always felt like she was searching for something she couldn't name. "I used to stand outside big houses like this one," Grace admitted one evening as they sat together on the porch swing, "and wonder what it would be like to belong somewhere that felt like home." Marcus had to wipe his eyes, thinking about how he'd taken that sense of belonging for granted, how he'd used his privilege as a weapon instead of a gift. Charles had aged 10 years backwards, his step lighter, his smile more frequent. He'd spent hours showing Grace photo albums and telling her stories about her mother. How Elena had sung lullabies in Spanish, how she'd insisted on planting sunflowers because they reminded her of hope. "She would have been so proud of the woman you became," he told his daughter repeatedly, and each time, Grace felt another piece of her heart click into place. The hardest part was Marcus confronting his own behavior. He'd apologized repeatedly, but words felt inadequate for the hurt he'd caused. It was Grace who finally took his hands and said, "You were protecting your father. You didn't know. But now you do, and that's what matters." Her forgiveness was genuine, but Marcus knew he had work to do to earn the relationship they both deserved. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. The house that had once felt cold and empty began to fill with laughter, with the sound of Grace's gentle humming echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. They were becoming a family, not just by blood, but by choice. 6 months later, the Wellington house had been transformed. Grace had moved into the suite that Charles had always kept ready for his daughter, complete with the childhood photos and toys he'd never been able to put away. She'd brought warmth to every corner, cooking family meals that filled the dining room with the kind of love that can't be bought with money. Marcus had changed too. His business dealings became more compassionate, his charity work more personal. He'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in the people who choose to stay in your life. The 3 of them established new traditions: Sunday dinners where they shared stories, evening walks through the gardens that Elena had once planned, and quiet moments where they'd look through old photographs and imagine the years they'd lost. Grace's aunt, whose medical bills had brought Grace to work at the house in the first place, became an honorary grandmother to them all. It was Charles who said it best: "Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning in disguise." Grace kept working, not as a housekeeper but as the family coordinator for the Wellington Foundation, helping other families reunite and healing the wounds that poverty and separation create. She'd found her purpose in the same place she'd found her family. Marcus learned to see people first, circumstances second, and discovered that his sister's gentle strength was exactly what their family business had been missing. On Elena's birthday that first year, they planted sunflowers together in the garden where she used to walk. As the golden petals turned toward the sun, Grace whispered, "Thank you for finding a way to bring us home to each other." Charles squeezed his daughter's hand while Marcus put his arm around both of them, and for the first time in 33 years, the Wellington family was complete. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that remind us that family isn't always about where you come from. Sometimes it's about where you finally find your place to belong. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, forgiveness, and the beautiful truth that it's never too late to come home.